Table or truth?
Anyway, in another note, in a Reuters, in a recent Reuters article, did you guys hear about this? By the way, those of you listening today, a new libertarian leader has been elected president of Argentina, named Javier Milei. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name. And he's really, to some, a breath of fresh air. To others, he is the global establishment's, and in particular, ultra-liberal, non-moderates' worst nightmare, especially if you happen to live in Argentina. If you haven't heard about him, let me elaborate a little bit more about him. Uh, now President Milei has pledged economic shock therapy on Argentina against the current establishment running the country, since if anybody's been looking at the actual political and economic state of Argentina in the last, 5 years at least, I'd have to get my economics game a little bit better, but they've been going through some seriously bad economic crises. And President Milei is really hopes to really attempt changes that are drastic, to completely shut off the valve of really terrible government spending policies and just overall government economic policies that have pretty much bankrupted the country, Argentina. And it is a shame that this has had to happen. Drastic times call for, unfortunately, drastic measures, right? So President Milei plans to shut down the central bank as of now, ditching the peso, and creating some serious, massive program spending cuts, especially wherever incompetence or, and I will quote, the woke programs that have been affecting the country after years of evidence that haven't really helped things. Pretty much his claims, okay? I'm just the guy reporting the news here, but...
Están perdiendo la batalla cultural los zurdos de mierda. Por primera vez se ven acorralados los zurdos de mierda.
He's obviously, the way I see it, going to make a lot of enemies here doing this. I feel bad. I think this guy means well. If he doesn't have a strong bodyguard and a military support to help overturn the country with enough understanding why he's going to this extreme, I don't know how well he's going to last down there. And I say this with concern because I think the best way to create change isn't just ripping the Band-Aid off completely. That never works. So I think, honestly, it has to be a slow trickle effect where enough people can be educated and see the gaping holes of logic and why some of the policies that have been pushed by the Argentinian government haven't been working. And I think from there, any political enemies that he has, or even citizens who had actually been okay with the establishment as it was, who might have benefited from that, apparently the corruption going on, would be forced to at least intellectually concede that this hasn't been working the country well. And with a slow trickle effect of changing things, this is just me, folks. I personally think that the pendulum effect of going from one extreme to the other won't be as shocking, and somehow it's easier to find the equilibrium in the middle where I believe all societies need to be, let's face it, because we're not all the same kind of people. But if we truly were mature enough to learn to coexist, and ideally enlightened enough to seek absolute truth, I think in any society, it's a lot easier than to follow the most rational, reasonable, and functional laws, rules, social mores, and mandates that are pushed or encouraged upon a society that ultimately would bring everybody individually and collective to a higher involuntary state of health and wellness. And I don't think that's done effectively when you pretty much purge the other side. But we'll see what happens, kids. It's almost a template for what could happen here if the old Donald became president in the next year or so. So that would be interesting just to see as a precursor, as a template. Anyway, if that depresses you or made you grin, depending who you are, let's take a look at this being an official episode of Table for Truth, even though admittedly a little bit rushed because I don't have the table tennis atmosphere of bouncing ideas back and forth with my colleague this week, permit me to give you some more news on current events this week. And this is interesting. In a recent article published by the New York Post on November 25th, titled "New York City is Keeping an Eye on Blue Cities," in the spirit of keeping an eye on certain cities here and seeing how their economic model has been working, I bring this article up because, as we all know, a lot of major cities in the U.S. have been suffering economically and doing not as well as they could have been doing in some alternate reality here. And I think even to the most hardcore detractors of conservative populist ideas or libertarian ideas, something doesn't seem to be sitting right functionally in the case of a lot of these major cities. So taking a look at this most recent thing going on, in a recent article by the New York Post, like I said, 2,500 officers as of now in 2023 have quit, making this the fourth highest number reported of officers leaving New York City in the last decades. Now, if you're listening to this and you're willing to do your own research and check these topics out for yourself, you might be asking yourself, why the hell is this happening? Well, one variable that some social scientists have pointed out is that with the sheer magnitude of migrants that have come in, where it seems that due to the brilliance of the city planners of New York City, failed to calculate how to economically support the new wave of migrants. It looks like, consequently, to help support and pretty much keep the migrants from freezing to death out in the streets now that it's getting colder, not to mention offering food, and other programs for them, or in other words, economically support the migrants. It looks like New York City has been forced to sacrifice the general safety, protection, and education programs that have been offered in the area for the sake of compensating for the migrants to live, of course, as they like to see it, the AOCs of the world. Sorry to bring that up, but I'm just saying, a life that is freer and better than from where they came from. So I guess on a noble cause, good for them, for all city planners to really want to help the migrants out. The obvious elephant in the room is, how the hell can you help migrants out if they're just going to end up freezing to death in the cold months ahead? And there's just not enough economic support to help these migrants to go around. So naturally, the first thing you got to do is create budget cuts in your city, and that looks like what they're doing now in New York City. Now, of course, if you're a police officer or a firefighter or a paramedic, this isn't going to sit well with you even if you didn't quit, because naturally there's a domino effect of the less cops that are around, we'll say, the more crime per unit cop that you have to regulate, the more you have to do the job for 2, 3, or 4 people, depending on how many people quit, being carried on the shoulders of just one officer. Now, of course, if you're not getting a pay raise, and the laws of physics being what it is, you can only do so much as one cop to regulate the town, unless, of course, you're robo-cop, which, strangely enough, New York City's already been contemplating the idea of having robot cops out there on the streets patrolling and fighting crime. Now, this, of course, sounds cool and futuristic and a dystopian sort of sci-fi kind of flair. But the reality of that is that that kind of protection system can easily allude to a higher surveillance system, including drones and other robotic entities that fight crime and purify everything in an almost ultra-legalistic way, thus causing a massive paradigm shift in these cities that may not necessarily be what the people want in the long run. But since I don't live in New York City, I have really no claims to say yay or nay on this. Of course, I'm not a big fan of getting a traffic ticket just because I happen to go 5 miles over the speed limit somewhere in Queens, we'll say, and the cameras were hidden, and so were the stupid signs that told me that I was going over the speed limit while I'm trying to kind of rush through traffic all around me in a cryptic game of mousetrap with the millions of other people that are just driving around the streets like salmon in a fast river running away from predators. But anyway, sorry about being over dramatic. Going back to this article, though, okay, the problem here is that it's gotten so bad in New York City that cops are willing to quit before they hit their full pension, which, when you think about it, is nuts. Now, I'm not necessarily blaming the cops for that. I get it. It's like when life becomes so unbearable, and unfair in terms of your occupation, and you really feel like you're being abused by the higher ups, and you're like, just either out of dignity or just sanity or survival, I can't do this job anymore, and you just find yourself being forced to quit. Now, of course, let's just do a thought experiment and assume that there may be a few corrupt bureaucrats up in office. That's a bonus for them, because if you don't have to pay pensions, well, that's more money that you save for the city, but that's another story. Bottom line, though, is if enough officers leave the city, okay, and again, never mind firefighters or any other emergency workers in the city, what happens then is inevitable. Those left over, okay, those officers that are still sticking around and fighting the good fight, have to work more hours, right? But as anyone who's ever worked a job under a chief boss has discovered, the job doesn't get any easier when there's less employees that should be there, that should be filling in the roles that now you have to do for other people who have just quit. So the work doesn't change. It's just the amount of work now that you're responsible for burdening becomes greater. And if they're never going to give you a raise, because obviously their budgets are tight, and no one gets rehired, you obviously just have to fill in the job for 2 people or maybe 3 or 10. And then once everything gets some more burdensome and you get burned out, and then you quit. And then, of course, the good workers in turn that are still left, it's like removing the foundations for a building and watch one I-beam after another crush under the weight of because of the missing I-beams that have been taken out of the equation, right? And so in this case, good workers like these officers, they just keep dropping. They drop out of the picture. So the question is, kids, does this really sound like a practical way to run a city? And I think most of us can appreciate that this is not the most well thought of policies that have been pushed by the city planners and the government, by the city bureaucrats that had pushed for the idea of asylum cities without economically calculating the consequences of what their well-meaning but boneheadedly calculated plays would happen if it ever came to fruition. And now, unfortunately, we're living and seeing the evidence of terrible policies being pushed in major cities all over the U.S. that happen to be blue. I'm sorry, I'm just saying. But maybe it's just me, right? Maybe it's just New York. Well, let's check out some other blue cities before we step out for this afternoon's episode. How about San Francisco's no better if you research them with what's been going on with a lot of these policies that have been pushed of defund the police or relax the traditional tough on crime, reap what you sow consequences of, like, robbing a store or whatever. And seeing the crime waves just go up higher and higher in these cities because there's naturally no consequences. Maybe I'm stereotyping and being unfair. Why don't we try Chicago? Chicago is not any better, as you know. Just recently, actually, a woman just got robbed by a gang in Chicago, and of course the cops refused to follow them because nobody really wants to deal with the sheer magnitude of criminals running around without at least some sort of a Batman-like superhero being able to assist, or enough police officers being available to just do their job in a proper and functional way. But so what are we learning here, folks? What is best in life? Hitting a like and subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with your friends and those you love, and even your enemies.